Hey, Alex.
So today we are talking about systems and systems thinking with regards to supervision.
Yeah, I'm really quite curious about this because the word system seems to be going around quite a bit or gaining more traction over the past, what's it, 18 months to 2 years. And yeah, I get a bit tickled about this because I get excited because it sounds something like quite cognitive and maybe complex, and those things excite me. And then every time I sort of apply my mind, I go, not quite sure what is completely encompassed in this. So looking forward to playing with it. Yeah.
Me too, and I like the descriptions that or the elements in your description, like the cognitive bit, and I, just reflecting on that quickly, I think that maybe it certainly can be cognitive if we look at it analytically, by definition, I guess. But I think if you relate it back to supervision, there's a non-cognitive aspect to it as well, like a more felt or empathic element to systems thinking. Let's not jump into that rabbit hole just yet. So where do you think would be a good place to start with regards to the topic?
So well, two things jumped to mind was maybe sharing some thinking about what we're talking about, what we think we're talking about when we talk about systems. Um, the other part was, I wonder if sometimes it's useful to start with the end in mind. So say, what's our objective of talking about this? Maybe there's both.
Okay. Do you have thoughts already?
Well, on the objective thing, it's always useful to have opportunities to create new awareness of potential things that are at play, and from that, seeing what are the practical implications in our practices as for us as coach supervisors, and then also for coaches, what are these systems relevant and valuable?
Yeah, I can't think of anything better than that. Sounds good.
Yes.
One for Andrew, minus one for Alex. All right.
Are we doing negative marking today?
Unfortunately, yeah. That's a negative mark for you for asking that question. All right. So it's part of the system. So what is it that we're thinking about when we talk about systems? Would you like to start?
You go first.
Okay. So I'm going to attempt to paraphrase the definition that I came across recently. Is a system consists of different elements which are interrelated, and I think to some degree can be coherent in their relationships. My own thinking is that there can be coherent systems that are related to other systems, and maybe the coherence kind of breaks down there. Like a human being is a coherent system, and when we form a group, there's a new system, and there might be other groups, and there can be groups of groups, So where the one starts and the other ends is maybe a little bit murky, but there's some kind of communication going on between them. And not necessarily to go into those topics now, but just to name them for future exploration. And I'm relating this back to supervision, is that some of that communication happens explicitly and some of it happens implicitly. And those mechanisms might be feedback loops. Some of them might happen on a macro scale, some of them might happen on a micro scale.
And that distinction of the communication might be explicit or implicit can be really helpful in identifying what's the actions that are necessary if there's an issue and something needs to be corrected or evolved.
And maybe other things too.
Yeah.
Did you want to add to the definition of systems?
There was one thing that sprung to mind when I was hearing your definition, and it was this idea out of group imagoes, and when there's one change in a group, the group is new. So you could have 10 members in a group and either add one person or exchange one person or even reduce to 9, and that constellation is now a brand new constellation. And so thinking about how there's almost a juxtaposition about systems is that it seems like in many ways they're quite resilient to change, but in other ways they're quite fragile to change. And maybe this is then highlighting why it's important to have an awareness around the interconnectedness of things.
My mind's racing when you mentioned constellations, because I think that's one way that systems are introduced into our awareness, into our cognitive awareness, but also our non-cognitive awareness. So it's about using representations of the elements of a system and their relationships, using metaphor, and I think that allows us to tune into what's happening in those relationships outside of the explicit, so what's typically seen cognitively.
Yeah. And anecdotally, I haven't been part of a group constellation workshop, but I have had conversations with many people that have either facilitated or have been participants. And the stories are, so many people come in saying, how I don't know this person, I don't know what this topic is, how can I be of value to this constellation? And all of a sudden, by being placed in that, they become aware of dynamics that are at play, and it's almost magical.
Good word to describe it. I'm thinking about another model that is specific to the coaching domain regarding systems, and that's the 7-eyed model of supervision, and there are other forms as well. This model authored originally by Peter Hawkins and then worked on by other people, which describes the role players and the dynamics within a typical system that a coach and a client would find themselves in. So before we started this, we talked about practical application, and maybe this is a good bridge into the practical application. What do you think?
Yeah. The 7-eyed model has always been the thing that I grab on first when I hear about systems, and it was a really valuable lens to start landing things. So having a hunch that there's something at play, and it was a really useful framework to start to hang things on hooks, or at least try and get something on the ground and work with more concretely.
Yeah. Would you walk us through your understanding of that? And we can fill in the gaps as we go, if there are any.
When you say understanding of that?
The 7-eyed model.
I was actually thinking you probably better to lead this, because I know you've done quite a bit of work on it in the not too distant past. Maybe it's more useful if we both speak to it anyway. Two voices make more color.
Yeah. Well, I'm happy to start if you want. So there are 3 role players. There's the coach's client, the coach, and the supervisor. And then there are less visible parts of that system. So I'm not necessarily going to go in the order in which they would appear theoretically. But if you imagine like a bubble surrounding all of those role players, and that bubble, what's in that bubble is contextually dependent. So within coaching in an organization, that bubble very basically would be what's happening in the organization, what are its strategies, what are its challenges, what are its processes, what's its culture, that kind of thing. If you look at a slightly different context, like personal coaching in a private context, the bubble would be the person's social life, friends and family. The society in which they live, their own culture, challenges, that kind of thing. But of course, these are just concepts to describe various things going around in the environment. And one could easily say that even within personal coaching, the person's work is a part of their system, and within organizational coaching, the person's personal life is a part of their system too. So what to consider within the environmental aspect of the system is determined by what the outcomes of the coaching are, as just one of the many factors.
Yeah. I was going to add to this that this is why in coach supervision, so often what's most important is what's the agreement. So the supervisor asking the coach, what have you been contracted to do? Because that already starts to set that big bubble.
And fill in it's like almost painting a picture of what exists in that bubble. Yeah, what is influential? What do you want to influence? What's important here? So the other parts of the model describe experiences and dynamics. They are about the relationship between the coach and their client. It's about what interventions the coach has used. So what are the approaches? What are the models? What are the frameworks? It's about the supervisor's experience of what's happening in the here and now in a session with the coach. If you look at more advanced models of the 7-eyed model, like the 8-eyed model, it's about the supervisor's philosophy. So, I mean, the name and the number of elements in the model dependent on the context as well. Like there's 10-eyed models as well regarding group coaching, that kind of thing. So not to get bogged down in the weeds about all the different elements, but these are just some of the major things that impact the coach and their client. Do you want to say more about it at this point?
So not to add any detail, because I think you're onto something that we might get bogged down in the weeds, but to reiterate the usefulness of the model, and so thinking it visually. So the 3 role players, there's a big bubble, and then there's looking at any opportunity of potential connections between any of the role players. Is a really useful way of getting, again, landing at and being curious about what dynamics might be explicitly at play or implicitly at play.
Yeah. In practical terms, what's the content of the explicit and implicit? How would you notice those?
So for the explicit, the things that come to mind are around what's the agreement? So exactly what have you been contracted to do? Those other elements that you were saying, if this is an organizational context, what's the strategy, the values, the philosophy of the organization? Those things are potentially easily accessed as explicit things, but then that's maybe the tip of the iceberg. And when you start to look underneath the level of the water and exploring how big is this iceberg really, is the implicit stuff. So going into the psychological levels, and often that comes out through experience with any of those role players in that model, in that system, looking out for patterns, and what you mentioned a couple of times of the supervisor's experience. So being tuned to when there's some of those sneaky psychological things that can happen between people around projective identification, projection, and what's the other one?
Transference and countertransference.
There we go. And so when the supervisor is tuned in to notice when that's happening, it can be a really powerful way of finding out what the implicit stuff is.
So when those phenomena are happening, countertransference and projection and all the rest, they are initiated, or they're stimulated by something which is probably unseen to the different role players, initially at least. It might be, so these are just examples and not necessarily the whole, well, they're not limiting descriptions of what can only happen. But challenges that an organization might experience would result in certain responses from the organization. For instance, fear, desperation, urgency, panic, domination, attacking, malintent, despondency. These are often things which are difficult to notice that one is experiencing because they are primal, they're feeling based, they're emotionally based, they're happening in emergency situations or close to emergency situations. So fight, flight, freeze, appease responses come in. You know, it'd be interesting to have a neuroscience expert here as well to talk about what happens in the brain when those things go on. And these are feelings which can unconsciously drive us to certain behaviors which are not necessarily beneficial, short-term or long-term or systemically, so reaching further than one's immediate environment, starting with self to team to section and whole organization or environment. I mean the physical environment, ecosystems, countries, things like that. And so in supervision, one can notice the dynamic between the people, between the supervisor and the coach, which might be a reflection of the dynamic between the coach and their own client. And then get down to what are the subjective experiences of the people in those relationships? What are the emotions that they're feeling? And when you talk about patterns, can you say a little bit more about what comprises a pattern in practical terms that would be that would emerge in a supervision conversation?
Yeah. So before I say something about that, what what I notice is also tempting when we speak so widely about systems is that it's tempting for the supervisor to potentially feel like they're responsible for the dynamics, and remembering that the supervisor works with the coach, and it's not trying to find a supervisor to try and coach the client, because that's probably indicative of an underlying issue of the system. So the focus here is that the supervisor works with the coach, and how the coach is showing up, being valuable to their client and their contract that they've been brought in to fulfill.
Can I say something about that quickly?
Sure.
So it's not the coach pulling the supervisor into the system. It's the supervisor and the coach stepping out of the system, or working towards stepping out of the system, so they can both look at it.
Yeah, it's that helicopter view, or going up onto the balcony and looking down at what's happening. Yeah, that's really useful. So you're not being dragged into it, and if you are feeling like you're getting dragged into it, that's something to look at.
And maybe contrary to what I've said, it might even be the supervisor being immersed in that system, kind of like a tuning fork, and then stepping out and saying, this is what I'm noticing when I was immersed in the system. And that invites both then back out to the helicopter view.
Yeah. So you were asking about patterns and what is that? I don't really have anything complex around this, but what I do for in my own practice is I almost have this imaginary chalkboard in my periphery, and as I'm present with my client, noticing what are the common themes that I might hear, or the pieces of theory that prick in my ear. So coming from transactional analysis, there's obviously loads of models in that, and so often one that comes up quite regularly is questioning something around the drama triangle. So on this chalkboard, I might go, I wonder if there's something about drama triangle, but I'm not going to jump in too soon. And it's seeing like how many little lines do we get under each recurring topical theme to see, is this actually a pattern, or is it a blip?
So,
and I use that to offer back. I use that then to offer to my supervision client. And this can work in many ways. Sometimes I will expressly offer something. Other times I will challenge, look for what's the question that I can ask instead, to see if there's something else that comes forth from them. So they're encouraging their thinking rather than me trying to plant a seed and trying to get it right. Because if I'm trying to get it right, then I'm stepping into a drama triangle myself. So that's my basic metaphor that I hold for myself. It's my little chalkboard. Notice the themes, and if I notice something, what do I do with it? Either asking questions or challenging the client, offering something, and taking it from there. What comes up for you when you think of patterns?
What you have said already, and I wanted to add to that a bit. It's not just that chalkboard being a cognitive process and feeding that back cognitively and looking at it analytically. it's about helping the person notice what their subjective experience within that system is as a whole person. So their thinking, their physical feeling, their emotional feeling, their behavior, what values are at play, what are the principles, what are the ethics. So it's cognitive and it's non-cognitive. And then that's like being able to realize what frequency the tuning fork is vibrating at, and then making sense of that with regards to some kind of framework. So I wanted to ask you what you think the value is. Let me take a step back. You and I are trained in the same modality of supervision. And I'm very clear to never make the assumption that the kind of supervision anyone does or has experienced is the same as any other kind, because I found there's so many different definitions and practices that we can only, I guess, speak with some expertise on our own. But in your practice of supervision, how does tagging the subjective experience onto a theoretical framework serve the coach and the other parties to the system?
Can you say the question again?
One of the things done in supervision is to that I think we've just discussed and I saw you nodding, was to explore the subjective experience of the coach within that system. But we do more than just that, which I think distinguishes supervision as a separate modality. And that extra thing that we do is to tag that subjective experience onto a piece of theory. And how is that useful?
Right. Okay. Yeah. So it's to get that distance. So with the subjective experience, I feel it in my body. So there's a connection with my head, my heart, and my gut. There's a subjectivity to it, and it can be very, when a person experiences that, it can be very tempting to get lost in the noise of it. And by linking it to a piece of theory, it helps to get that, to pull yourself out of it and get that helicopter or that balcony perspective. So you're trying to disconnect or disentangle your own script beliefs or the things that make things interactions complicated for yourself, and try to get some objectivity around it to make sense of it. Within that process, a lot of things can happen. So you can start sorting out some of that script belief that might have been limiting in the past. And on that, there's a much greater chance of seeing options of how to then get back into the play and have a positive impact on how it plays out.
Yeah, I love what you said. Because it's not what I was thinking, but it's so true.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. No, I guess I was over-focused in my own mind on one particular aspect of the benefit, and but I think what you've said is is one of the primary benefits. That distance. Other things that I think it does is it provides a model for the pattern that people can recognize not only in those specific circumstances, but over time. And not only over time, but in different contexts. So there are many different dimensions that are different from the specific case brought, in which the person can use that tool of the model and apply it. They're smiling.
A metaphor popped in my mind. I'll share it
Yeah,
with you now.
what's it?
So in old English country estates, so the big manor house in the staff's like main operating space, there's a panel of, it used to be brass bells. So in each of the rooms there would be a pretty velvet cord, and you would ring the bell when you wanted assistance and when somebody wanted assistance in that room. So this process, it's like developing your own switchboard almost of being able to identify, oh, there's attention needed in the dining room. And so you don't just know, oh, there's a bell ringing, you know, oh, I need to go do something in the dining room. It's not, I have to now go search the entire estate to find out where the help is needed.
Yeah, exactly. That's such a good metaphor. That what I wanted to say, I was struggling to formulate in words. That metaphor speaks to it very well. It's about there are, my own experience has been these phenomena that I notice in my own life, like my personal stuff, like my style of problem solving and where I get hooked by people or circumstances, has many, it's like an onion, there are many layers to it. So I can unpack it and think, oh, okay, this is how I got triggered, and there'll be like a transformational aspect to that too, where I feel more in homeostasis, and I'm able to be more present and authentic to whatever the challenge was. But I will experience something different in nuanced ways, and I'll get triggered again. And the model performs such a useful function there in that it's inspecific enough that it's not only applicable to one set of circumstances, but it's structured enough that I can notice it manifesting in a wide variety of circumstances and over time. And I think that's important to coaches, because they hopefully are seeing a number of different people that they're helping, and each of those circumstances will be different, and the time will be different as well. So it enables them to have I think there are many disadvantages to this metaphor, but almost like a rescue boy kind of thing, you know. It's like,
yeah,
oh shit, here I am getting stuck again. What might this be? And then from the ongoing supervision, there will be models that they can draw on to make sense of it. So it's like it's integrating supervision into oneself not necessarily having to rely on another person to go to, which supervision certainly isn't. Reliance, about being equipped.
And it's very tempting when we use that kind of language to describe it, that it sounds cognitive, but a reminder that it comes from an integrative somatic place, or and from a place of integration. So knowing like, oh my goodness, I'm feeling a familiar tightness in my chest. I know what this is about because I've explored it so many times in supervision, and be able to respond dynamically in the moment.
Yeah. Kind of nearing the end of our time. What else needs to be said?
So our discussion's been under the umbrella of systems, and I'm kind of having a bit of an internal giggle at myself, because when I first started taking note of this terminology of systems, it's like, oh, what's this? Is this something new that I have to go and study and explore and get, potentially even get certified in something or other? And then as we talk about it, I realize this is something that I do know. And there's obviously plenty of stuff that's still to be found, and that's quite all right. So feeling a bit tickled about how maybe my Be Perfect was getting ahead of the matter.
That's such a great echo of what happens in a supervision session looking at systems. There's always stuff that people already know, I think, and the conversation may be guided by some systems thinking. Just sheds light on other aspects that one's not yet aware of, and there's always more.
Yeah, and that's okay.
Oh, well, I think it's the only way it can be. Ongoing learning.
Yeah.
There's a time.
Anything else? Yeah, I think we're there.
So what do the people have to do?
If you'd be so obliging to subscribe. Hopefully Alex is pointing at a subscribe button.
And like.
And feel free to comment. We'd love to hear your own thoughts. And if you have any other questions are great. It prompts thinking, and maybe we can explore this topic in more detail and depth at a future date.
Yeah, send us your questions.
Thanks, Alex.
Thank you.